You think you know what makes a species apex? It isn't faster than light propulsion or directed energy weapons. It is the primal, terrifying chemistry of a nervous system that absolutely refuses to die. This is the classified combat log of the day the galaxy learned why you never corner a human. The mud on Kepler 186F did not just stick to your boots. It felt like it actively hated you. It was thick, corrosive, and smelled faintly of sulfur and burnt copper. Sergeant David Collins stood at the perimeter fence of Outpost Charlie Niner, staring out into the dense, violet-hued foliage of the jungle. The rain came down in sheets, drumming a relentless, deafening rhythm against the composite plating of his tactical helmet. Outpost Charlie Niner was not a military installation. Not officially. It was a forward extraction point owned and operated by the Aegis Heavy Industries Corporation, contracted out to the United Nations Colonial Initiative. They were mining a highly unstable isotope used in deep space navigational arrays. Because of the high-value nature of the asset, Aegis had spared no expense on security. The perimeter was lined with General Dynamics automated sentry turrets, and the 50 men and women stationed there were outfitted in Lockheed Martin EX, 4 combat exoskeletons, lightweight, hydraulic-assisted frames designed to help humans carry heavy loads and survive blunt force trauma. David adjusted the grip on his FN SCAR-H magnetically accelerated rifle. It was a heavy, ugly piece of machinery, chambered in discarding Sabot tungsten rounds. It was loud, it kicked like a mule, and it was entirely reliable. Beside him, Corporal William Reed was shivering, despite the climate controls in his suit. "Radar is ghosting again, Sarge," William said, tapping the side of his helmet. "Getting weird atmospheric bounce. Looks like a localized electromagnetic storm moving in." David frowned, pulling up his own heads-up display. The green reticle on his visor flickered, the topographical map of the jungle distorting into a mess of jagged static. "It's the isotope," David replied, his voice calm, broadcast over the encrypted short-range squad channel. "Whenever they crack a new vein in the primary shaft, the magnetic interference spikes. Just keep your eyes peeled. The local wildlife gets skittish when the weather turns." But it was not the local wildlife that was moving through the dense brush. 80 miles in the upper atmosphere, a stealth frigate belonging to the Coalition, a multi-species hegemony that had ruled this quadrant of the Orion Arm for 3 millennia, had slipped past the Aegis orbital buoys. Commander Valerian stood on the bridge of the drop cruiser, watching the optical feeds of the primitive human settlement below. Valerian was a veteran tactician. His species, humanoid in structure, but possessing a highly refined, hypersensitive neural physiology, considered war to be a matter of precise surgical logic. They did not fight wars of attrition. They fought wars of absolute, instantaneous shock. Their weapons were designed not to tear flesh or shatter bone, but to overload the central nervous system of their enemies. In the history of the Coalition, no species had ever required more than a single volley to surrender. "Commander," the tactical officer reported, his voice a soft, melodic hum translated through Valerian's earpiece. "The interference field is active. The mammalian settlement is blind. We are in position for a decapitation strike." Valerian nodded slowly. "Execute. Leave the infrastructure intact. The isotope is the priority. Exterminate the guards with extreme prejudice. Let us see how these humans respond to the elegance of Coalition technology." Back on the ground, David Collins wiped a layer of grime from his visor. He was about to tell William to cycle the radar frequency when the sky simply tore open. There was no sound of approaching engines, no warning klaxon. The first sign of the attack was the sudden, blinding flash of ionized plasma cutting through the heavy rain. A beam of blinding blue light struck the General Dynamics sentry turret to their left. The turret did not explode. Instead, the air around it rippled with a concussive shockwave, and the internal circuitry instantly fused. Before David could even raise his rifle, the tree line erupted. Sleek, silver drop pods slammed into the mud, their doors deploying in a synchronized hiss of pressure. Tall, slender figures, clad in frictionless white armor, poured out, moving with an eerie, gliding grace. "Contact! Contact front!" David roared into his comms, the training taking over instantly. He slammed his shoulder into the concrete barricade, bringing the FN SCAR-H up and squeezing the trigger. The heavy weapon barked, spitting a stream of tungsten death into the jungle. Beside him, William was already firing, panic evident in the erratic bursts. "What the hell are those things?" "Sarge, I can't get a lock." Suppressing fire! Keep them pinned! David yelled, his heart hammering against his ribs. The outpost erupted into chaos. Alarms finally began to shriek, slicing through the roar of the rain and the deafening crack of human firearms. From the main barracks, members of the Aegis security detail scrambled into the courtyard, half-dressed in their combat gear, trying to establish a defensive line. But the coalition forces did not take cover. They did not flank or maneuver. They simply marched forward in a perfect, terrifying line, raising their weapons. The alien rifles were sleek, silent things. When they fired, they did not project bullets or explosive charges. They projected concentrated beams of tachyon-charged ions, a weapon specifically engineered to target pain receptors and neural pathways. A beam grazed a security contractor running across the courtyard. It didn't burn a hole in him, it didn't sever a limb, but the moment the energy touched his shoulder, the man dropped his weapon, let out a scream that sounded like his vocal cords were tearing, and collapsed into the mud, violently convulsing before going entirely, horrifyingly still. David watched in sheer disbelief. "Medical! We need a medic in the courtyard!" he screamed, but as he looked around, he saw the same nightmare playing out in every direction. Wherever the blue beam struck, men and women dropped instantly, their nervous systems completely overloaded, their hearts stopping from the sheer, unfathomable shock of the pain. They were being slaughtered, not by superior firepower, but by a biological hack. And the coalition soldiers were advancing, unbothered, stepping over the fallen with the cold detachment of exterminators clearing a nest. Commander Valerian watched the tactical feed from the safety of the rear echelon, 50 yards deep in the jungle foliage. His visor displayed the biometric data of the battlefield. The blue icons of his soldiers advanced steadily, while the red icons of the human defenders rapidly blinked out, one by one. It was proceeding exactly according to the mathematical models. The weapon his troops wielded was the neural lattice ionizer. In the Coalition's long history of conquest, they had categorized sentient life into strict biological parameters. Every known species in the galaxy shared a common evolutionary trait, a deeply ingrained, highly sensitive network of pain receptors designed to protect the organism from damage. When these receptors were stimulated beyond a certain threshold, referred to in Coalition science as the Kalin limit, the brain would initiate an automatic, irreversible shutdown to prevent unimaginable suffering. It was a mercy, in a way. Brain death via catastrophic systemic shock. A 2% activation of the pain network was enough to drop a massive reptilian predator from the core worlds. A 5% activation was enough to kill a silicon-based behemoth. The ionizers were currently set to 15%. Overkill. Absolute, undeniable overkill. "Commander," the tactical officer reported, a hint of boredom in his tone. "The human perimeter is collapsing. Their kinetic weapons are primitive. They rely on localized explosive reactions to propel metal fragments. A few of our vanguard have taken kinetic impacts, but our kinetic shielding is holding. The mammalian physiology is remarkably fragile to ion shock." "Expected," Valerian replied, steepling his gloved fingers. "They are a young species. They build loud machines, but their biology is unrefined. Push the vanguard forward. Secure the main shaft of the mine. Leave no survivors. We do not have the logistical infrastructure to process prisoners of this biological class." At the barricade, David Collins was rapidly running out of ammunition and options. The rain was washing the mud and the grime into his eyes, but he couldn't take his hands off his rifle to wipe it away. The smell of ozone was thick in the air, a sharp, metallic stench that overpowered the sulfur of the planet. William was still firing beside him, but the younger man was hyperventilating, his breaths coming in ragged, terrified gasps over the comms. "Sarge, my shots are bouncing off them! They have some kind of energy shielding!" William cried out as a tungsten round sparked harmlessly off the chest plate of an advancing alien soldier. "Aim for the joints!" David barked back, ejecting a spent magazine and slamming a fresh one into the receiver. "The shielding is kinetic. It has to have flex points for them to walk. Aim for the knees and the neck." David proved his point by sighting down his optic and firing a 3-round burst at the nearest alien's throat. The tungsten sabots found the microscopic gap between the helmet and the chest plate. The alien soldier snapped backward, a spray of luminescent pale blue fluid erupting from the suit. The figure collapsed into the mud, thrashing weakly. For a fraction of a second, the alien advance halted, It was the first casualty the Coalition had suffered on this world. In the rear, Commander Valerian's eyes widened slightly at the telemetry data. Unit 7 has been terminated. How? A lucky kinetic strike, Commander. It bypassed the primary deflector array, the tactical officer said, sounding more annoyed than concerned. Valerian's expression hardened. Unacceptable. Eradicate that specific defensive pocket. Authorize 40% ion output. Burn their nervous systems to ash. On the battlefield, 3 of the tall, white-armored figures slowly turned their featureless helmets toward David's barricade. They raised their sleek rifles, the muzzles glowing with an intense, blinding sapphire light. "Incoming!" David screamed, diving low behind the concrete. The blue beams struck the barricade. The concrete didn't shatter, but it instantly superheated, the moisture inside turning to steam and exploding outward. William shrieked as a glancing beam of blue energy clipped his shoulder. David watched in horror as William's entire body went rigid. The young corporal's eyes rolled back in his head, his jaw locking so hard David heard the teeth crack. William didn't even have time to fall. His muscles seized so violently that he remained frozen in a half-crouch for 3 agonizing seconds before his heart gave out, and he crumpled lifelessly to the ground. "Will!" David yelled, reaching out to grab his squadmate's armor. But it was too late. The biometric readout on David's HUD for William's vitals flatlined instantly. No bleeding. No visible trauma. Just instant, catastrophic death. A cold, primal terror gripped David's chest. He had seen combat before. He had seen men torn apart by shrapnel, burned by incendiaries. But this silent, immediate switch from life to death, it broke every rule of warfare he understood. He didn't have time to mourn. He didn't have time to think. One of the alien soldiers had flanked the shattered barricade, stepping gracefully over the smoking concrete. The alien raised its rifle, pointing the glowing muzzle directly at David's chest. David tried to bring his FN Scar-H up, but the hydraulic servos in his right arm had been jammed by the exploding concrete. He was too slow. The alien fired. The beam of tachyon-charged ions hit David square in the center of his chest plate. The world slowed down. Commander Valerian, watching through the ocular feed of his vanguard soldier, prepared to log another instant biological termination. At 40% ion output, the pain receptors in the human's body would scream so loudly that the brain would effectively vaporize its own synapses in self-defense. The beam struck the hardened Kevlar and ceramic trauma plate of David's armor. The armor did nothing to stop the energy. The tachyons bypassed the physical matter entirely, sinking directly into the network of nerves surrounding David's heart, lungs, and spinal column. What the Coalition Science Division did not understand, what Commander Valerian could not possibly have known, was the evolutionary history of Earth. The Coalition species had evolved on peaceful, low-gravity garden worlds. They were herbivores who had achieved sentience through slow, careful civilization. Pain, to them, was a polite biological suggestion to stop doing something harmful. Humans did not evolve on a garden world. Humans evolved on a high-gravity death world, surviving as pursuit predators. For millions of years, the human body had been subjected to crushing physical trauma, apex predators, disease, and brutal elemental extremes. To survive, the human brain developed the most terrifying chemical failsafe in the known universe, the endocrine system. When the ionizer beam struck David, it simulated the most agonizing pain imaginable. It sent a signal to his brain that his body was being dipped in boiling acid, crushed by a mountain, and electrocuted all at once. By all Coalition metrics, David Collins should have died in a millisecond. Instead, the human brain registered the catastrophic pain not as a reason to shut down, but as an existential threat. In the span of a microsecond, David's adrenal glands dilated. A massive, lethal dose of epinephrine and cortisol flooded his bloodstream. His heart rate spiked from 90 beats per minute to 2 to 120. Endorphins, naturally occurring opiates stronger than any synthetic painkiller, washed over his neural pathways, acting as a chemical firewall against the ionizer's overload. The pain didn't kill him, it just made him angry. To the alien soldier standing 3 feet away, the human was supposed to drop dead. Instead, David Collins let out a sound. It wasn't a scream of agony. It was a low, guttural roar that tore from the absolute bottom of his lungs, a sound born of millions of years of primal, ape-like fury. The sound vibrated through the external speakers of his helmet, echoing across the muddy courtyard. The alien soldier froze, its weapon still leveled, the muzzle glowing faintly. For a brief, fatal moment, confusion paralyzed the coalition trooper. David's muscles, flooded with enough adrenaline to flip a transport rover, contracted with bone-snapping force. His jammed hydraulic exoskeleton screamed in protest as he forcefully bypassed the mechanical lockout, physically tearing the servo gears with sheer, drug-fueled human strength. He didn't raise his rifle, he didn't have the leverage. Instead, David lunged forward, closing the distance before the alien could cycle its weapon for a second shot. David slammed his Kevlar-plated fist directly into the center of the alien's featureless visor. The kinetic force of a biologically enraged human, augmented by the heavy metal plating of his gauntlet, was devastating. The advanced kinetic shielding of the Coalition armor, designed to deflect high-velocity projectiles, was simply not calibrated to register a slow, blunt-force melee strike. The visor cracked. The alien stumbled backward, letting out a high-pitched, melodic squeal of panic. David didn't stop. The pain in his chest was a roaring inferno, but the adrenaline had pushed it to the background, turning it into raw fuel. He grabbed the barrel of the alien's rifle, ripped it from the creature's grasp, and drove the heavy stock of his own jammed Scar H into the side of the alien's helmet. The composite material shattered, and the soldier went down in the mud, blue fluid pooling around its head. In the command center, deep in the jungle, Commander Valerian staggered backward, his hands flying to his command console. "What happened? Give me a tactical playback," Valerian demanded, his voice cracking with an emotion he had not felt in decades. "Fear." "Commander?" the tactical officer stammered, staring at the biometric telemetry on the main screen. The human, it took a direct hit. 40% ion output. The physiological feedback shows catastrophic neural trauma. Its nervous system is effectively destroyed. "Then why is it still moving?" Valerian shouted, pointing at the optical feed. On the screen, through the eyes of the remaining Vanguard soldiers, the nightmare was unfolding. David Collins was not just moving, he was advancing. His armor was scorched, smoke pouring from the center of his chest plate where the ionizer had struck. His breathing was heavy, ragged, sounding like a broken bellows over the open comms channel. He was bleeding from his nose and eyes, the sheer blood pressure from the adrenaline spike bursting the capillaries in his face. To the aliens, he looked like a broken, bleeding corpse that simply refused to lay down. David stepped over the fallen alien, dropping his jammed rifle. He reached down to his tactical belt and drew his sidearm, a hefty, archaic, .45 caliber combat pistol. It was a heavy block of cold steel, devoid of any advanced targeting optics. He raised it with a trembling yet terrifyingly steady hand. 3 coalition soldiers turned their weapons on him. They fired simultaneously. 3 blue beams of tachyon energy struck David. One hit his left shoulder, one hit his thigh, and one grazed his neck. By coalition biology, this was enough to kill a colony of their kind. The pain data transmitted to their sensors was so overwhelmingly high that the tactical computer flagged the human as biologically deceased. David stumbled. He dropped to one knee in the mud, his head bowing. Valerian let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. Finally, the organism's latency period has ended. It is dead. But in the mud, David Collins's brain was executing its final, desperate protocol. The human body is capable of tearing its own muscles off the bone, of snapping its own ligaments if the restriction of safety is removed. The brain disables these limiters only in the face of absolute certain death. David's head snapped up. Behind the cracked, rain-streaked visor, his eyes were bloodshot, pupils dilated edge to edge, turning his eyes into black, soulless pits. He planted his boot in the mud. He forced himself up. His left arm hung completely useless at his side, the nerves finely fried, but his right arm remained locked straight out, gripping the .45 pistol. Bang! The heavy slug caught the first alien under the chin, snapping its head back violently. It dropped instantly. David took a step forward, dragging his paralyzed left leg slightly through the mud. Bang! 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 The second alien, paralyzed by the sheer impossibility of what it was witnessing, took a round squarely in the center of mass. The kinetic force bowled it over backwards into the muck. The third alien did the unthinkable for a coalition soldier. It dropped its weapon and took a step backward, raising its hands in a biological reflex of submission. "Commander!" The tactical officer's voice was bordering on hysteria. The telemetry! The human is clinically dead! Its heart is beating at a rate that should rupture the organ. Its pain receptors are fully saturated. It is a biological impossibility. It is an undead weapon. Valerian stared at the screen, his mind unable to process the data. He was a creature of logic, of science, of predictable, elegant warfare. The being on the screen was defying the fundamental laws of biology. It had taken enough neural energy to power a small city block straight into its nervous system, and it was still walking forward, using primitive chemical explosions to murder his elite vanguard. Is this what humans are? Valerian whispered, the color draining from his face. Have they engineered themselves to ignore death? Commander, the vanguard is breaking. They are retreating. On the feed, the sight of the bloody, smoking human limping forward, firing the deafening hand cannon, had broken the psychological conditioning of the coalition troops. They had never faced an enemy that didn't die when killed. Panic, a contagious, deeply repressed evolutionary trait, swept through the alien ranks. They abandoned their perfectly organized lines, turning and fleeing into the jungle, dropping their sophisticated weapons in the mud. David Collins kept walking. Every step was an agony he couldn't even articulate, a symphony of shattered nerves and chemical fire. But the primitive part of his brain only had one objective: move forward. Eliminate the threat. Protect the pack. He reached the edge of the jungle, standing amidst the dropped alien weaponry. He slowly turned his helmet toward the thickest part of the brush, exactly where Commander Valerian's command post was hidden. Through the optical feed, Valerian felt as though the human was staring directly into his soul. "Shut down the weapons," Valerian said, his voice completely hollow. "Commander?" "I said shut them down! Deactivate the ionizers remotely," Valerian commanded, frantically punching codes into his console. "Broadcast the universal frequency of surrender on all open channels. Now!" "But Commander, we have the orbital advantage. We can bombard the settlement." Valerian grabbed the tactical officer by the collar of his pristine white uniform. "Look at the screen! Look at it! We shot it with enough energy to boil a neural cortex, and it merely got angry. If we bombard them from orbit, and they survive, what do you think they will do to us when they reach the stars? Broadcast the surrender. We yield the planet." The universal surrender frequency was an archaic, unencrypted burst of radio telemetry designed to bypass all known jamming fields. It screamed through the communication systems of Outpost Charlie Niner, a shrill, repeating trill that automatically translated into standard English across the Aegis tactical network. Hostilities cease. Aggressor yields. At the edge of the jungle, the rain continued to pour, washing the glowing blue fluid of the coalition casualties into the dark, churning mud. Commander Valerian emerged from the dense violet foliage. He walked slowly, his hands raised, his featureless white helmet retracted to expose his face. He was pale, humanoid, but lacking the rugged, asymmetrical imperfections of a human. His eyes were wide, dark, and fixated entirely on the lone figure standing 20 yards away. Behind Valerian, the remaining 12 members of his elite vanguard followed suit, their weapons left in the dirt, their posture slumped in profound, unprecedented defeat. Sergeant David Collins stood his ground. His right arm was still locked out, the .45 caliber combat pistol aimed directly at Valerian's chest. To Valerian, the human looked like a nightmare, sculpted from ruin. The ceramic plating of David's Lockheed Martin exoskeleton was shattered, the underlying Kevlar weave singed and smoking. The human was bleeding heavily from his nose and the corners of his eyes, the sheer hydrostatic shock of his blood pressure having ruptured dozens of microvessels. "We yield," Valerian said, his voice trembling as the internal translator broadcast his words over the open channel. "The conflict is over. We power down our arrays. Do not fire." David did not respond. He simply stared, his dilated pupils turning his eyes into twin black voids. He was no longer a soldier making tactical decisions. He was a biological machine running on the absolute fumes of prehistoric survival instincts. The threat was still in front of him. The gun remained raised. "Sergeant Collins, stand down!" The voice barked over the local comms. From the shattered remains of the outpost barricades, surviving Aegis security contractors were cautiously advancing, their FN Scar-H rifles leveled at the alien prisoners. Captain Richard Hayes, the outpost commander, pushed his way to the front. "David, they surrendered! Drop the weapons, son! It's over!" Hayes yelled, stepping into David's peripheral vision. The moment the auditory processing center of David's brain registered the voice of his commanding officer, a recognized safe alpha of his pack, the chemical firewall collapsed. The adrenal glands instantly ceased production. The endorphins evaporated, and the reality of what the neural lattice ionizer had done to his body came crashing down like a collapsing skyscraper. David didn't lower the gun. He simply dropped it as his fingers lost all motor function. His eyes rolled back into his head, and he collapsed face first into the mud, his armor crashing heavily against the earth. "Medic! Get a trauma team out here now!" Hayes roared, waving frantically toward the barracks. Valerian watched in stunned silence as two humans sprinted across the compound. They were not wearing heavy combat armor, only lightweight fatigues marked with red crosses. Medic Sarah Jenkins and Dr. Robert Callahan hit the mud, sliding, dropping a heavy olive-drab medical crate beside David's motionless body. "He's unresponsive. Pulse is thready, heart rate is 190, and dropping fast," Jenkins shouted, her hands flying over the manual releases of David's exoskeleton. She ripped the shattered chest plate away, exposing the scorched, bruised flesh beneath his undersuit. "Pupils are blown." "He took a direct energy hit," Callahan said, pulling a massive syringe from the kit. "Massive neural trauma. The system is crashing. Give me 1 milligram of epinephrine direct IV push." Valerian stood paralyzed, watching the frantic display. His tactical computer was still running, analyzing the human medical response. He watched as the human doctor jammed a needle into the sergeant's arm, willingly injecting him with a synthetic version of the very chemical that had caused his biological system to overdrive in the first place. "They are poisoning him," Valerian whispered to his tactical officer, who stood shivering beside him. "The heart is already failing from overexertion, and they are accelerating it." "Doctor, we're losing him! He's in VFib!" Jenkins yelled, staring at a small biometric monitor. "Heart's out of rhythm. The electrical pathways are fried." Callahan gritted his teeth, tearing open the casing of a Zoll X-Series tactical defibrillator. He yanked out 2 adhesive pads, slapping one on David's upper right chest and the other on his lower left ribs. "Clear the deck! Charging to 200 joules!" Callahan shouted, his thumb hovering over the shock button. Valerian's eyes widened in absolute, unadulterated horror. He recognized the energy output building in the human medical device. It was a localized, high-voltage electrical charge. It was, for all intents and purposes, the exact same principle as the Coalition's neural lattice ionizers, only delivered via direct kinetic contact. "Wait!" Valerian screamed, taking a step forward. "What are you doing? His nervous system is already destroyed. You will vaporize his remaining synapses." Captain Hayes slammed the butt of his rifle into Valerian's chest, dropping the alien commander to his knees in the mud. "Shut your mouth and stay down," Hayes snarled. "Clear!" Callahan yelled. He pressed the button. The defibrillator discharged perfectly. 200 joules of raw electricity slammed into David Collins's chest. The sergeant's entire body seized, lifting violently off the mud, as the shock forced every muscle in his torso to contract simultaneously. Valerian watched the biometric readout on the human monitor. By every law of biology, the Coalition understood that electrical strike should have permanently terminated the human. Instead, the erratic, chaotic scribbles on the heart monitor suddenly spiked, leveled out, and fell into a steady, rhythmic beep. Beep, beep, beep. "We have sinus rhythm. He's back. Let's get him on a backboard. Move!" Callahan ordered, wiping the rain and sweat from his forehead. Valerian slumped completely into the mud, the rain beating against his pale skin. His mind was utterly broken. He looked up at Captain Hayes, his voice barely a hollow rasp. "Your medical technology. To save a dying soldier. You shoot him with lightning?" Hayes looked down at the alien commander, rain dripping from the brim of his helmet, and offered a cold, humorless smile. "No, we just turn it off and turn it back on again. Welcome to Earth, you son of a bitch." 3 weeks later, the atmosphere aboard the United Nations naval intelligence cruiser UNS Nimitz was sterile, quiet, and aggressively cold. Commander Valerian sat in a hardened steel interrogation room. He was no longer wearing his pristine white combat armor, but a simple gray prisoner's jumpsuit. His hands were bound to the table by magnetic cuffs, though the restraint was entirely unnecessary. Valerian had not offered a single act of resistance since Kepler 186F. In fact, he had been terrifyingly compliant. The heavy steel door slid open with a hydraulic hiss, and General Maxwell Grant walked into the room. Grant was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with silver hair and a face carved from years of deep space military logistics. He sat down across from Valerian, placing a thick paper file on the table. "Commander Valerian," Grant began, his voice a low, gravelly baritone. "The Coalition High Command has officially received our transmission. They have agreed to our terms. Unconditional withdrawal from the Kepler sector, complete forfeiture of the mining rights on 186F, and a 5-parsec demilitarized zone around all United Nations territories." Valerian nodded slowly. "I am not surprised, General. I recommended they accept whatever terms you dictated." Grant leaned forward, crossing his arms. "That's what I find interesting. We analyzed the telemetry from your stealth cruiser. You had us dead to rights. You had orbital superiority, advanced energy shielding, and a biological weapon that, on paper, should have wiped out Outpost Charlie 9er in 5 minutes. Yet, you surrendered without a single human casualty to orbital fire. Your official report to your superiors was heavily encrypted, but we broke it. You advised them that engaging humanity in a war of attrition would lead to the extinction of the Coalition." "It would," Valerian said softly. "Why?" Grant asked, narrowing his eyes. "You lost one squad. You could have bombarded the outpost from orbit and taken the isotope." Valerian looked up, his dark eyes locking onto the general's. "Because, General Grant, wars are not won by weapons. They are won by psychology. My people have conquered 100 worlds. We did so because we understand the fundamental math of biology. All sentient life avoids pain. All sentient life surrenders when the bodily system reaches a state of catastrophic trauma." Valerian paused, a slight shudder working its way through his shoulders. "And then I watched your Sergeant Collins. We hit him with a 40% ion yield. We burned his neural pathways. We subjected his brain to a level of agony that would kill a cetacean leviathan. And his biology did not shut down. His biology weaponized the trauma. It flooded his system with chemical stimulants and forced him to keep fighting. He was clinically dead, General, and he kept walking." Grant's expression remained stony, though a flicker of undeniable pride danced in his eyes. "If we bombarded your outpost from orbit," Valerian continued, his voice dropping to a whisper, "we would have killed those 50 humans. But we would have drawn the attention of billions more. If we engaged your species in a planetary war, we would be fighting an enemy that does not recognize biological limits. You are a species that uses our ultimate weapon, high-voltage neural shock, as basic first aid to restart your own hearts. How do we fight an enemy that literally resurrects itself on the battlefield?" Grant opened the file on the table and slid a photograph across the metal surface. It was a picture of Sergeant David Collins. He was sitting up in a hospital bed in the Nimitz's medical bay. His left arm was wrapped in a synthetic nerve-graft cast, and his face was heavily bruised, but he was awake, holding a cup of coffee and offering a faint, tired smile to the camera. "He's going to make a full recovery," Grant said quietly. "Our neuroplasticity is highly adaptable. With a little physical therapy, he'll be back on active duty in 6 months." Valerian stared at the photograph for a long, agonizing minute. He reached out with a trembling finger, tracing the edge of the paper as if it were a forbidden artifact. "You are Apex," Valerian murmured. "Not because you have the biggest ships or the most elegant weapons, but because you are too angry to die." General Grant stood up, collecting the photograph and sliding it back into the file. He looked down at the broken alien commander, the representative of a galactic hegemony that had ruled undisputed for 3 millennia. "You did the right thing on that planet, Commander. You saved your species from finding out just how angry we can get." Grant turned and walked toward the door. As it slid open, he paused, glancing over his shoulder. "Tell your superiors to respect the boundary lines, because if they don't, next time, we won't stop walking." The door sealed shut, leaving Valerian alone in the cold room, staring at the empty table, forever haunted by the ghost of the human who refused to die. Did this classified combat log leave you breathless? Humanity's primal refusal to surrender isn't just science fiction. It is written in our very DNA. If you love this deep dive into the true meaning of an apex species, hit that like button and share it with a fellow Earthling. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell for more epic, adrenaline-fueled sci-fi stories every week. Stay strong and never stop walking forward.
Hi, my name is Tran Truong, the owner and manager of Palace Truths. After watching the video, the human kept walking after getting shot. The alien commander immediately surrendered. I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What stood out to me most was the sense of determination running through the story. Watching a character refuse to quit in the face of overwhelming odds creates a feeling of respect and admiration. Beyond the sci-fi setting, it's really a story about resilience and the impact that courage can have on the people around us. One lesson I took from it is that strength is often revealed during the moments when giving up would be the easiest option. In everyday life, we all face challenges that test our patience and resolve. And sometimes simply taking the next step forward matters more than anything else. What was your favourite moment in the story? And do you think the alien commander surrendered because of fear, respect, or a little of both? Thanks for spending time with Palace Truths. If this story meant something to you, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments, and maybe like or subscribe for more stories like this.